This deep dive into the Warhammer 40,000 fight phase is sponsored by the Magnet Baron, your one-stop shop for all your magnetization needs. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another Rules Deep Dive. What we're going to be doing today is talking about the combat movements of 10th edition 40k, those being the charge and fight phases. Now, what we're not going to be doing today is talking about the attack sequence specifically. All we're going to be doing is talking about resolving charges, pile-in, and consolidate movements, as well as a little bit of targeting within the fight phase. I may discuss attacks, attack sequences, and weapon abilities later on in a future video, so let me know down in the comment section if that's something you'd be interested in. And obviously, as always, subscribe to the channel if you like my 40k content, and if you want to get notified when one of those videos comes out. I'm going to be talking about the rules as they are written at the time of recording. There may be changes to these rules in the future, and you can check down in the video description and the pinned comment. I will update those as changes occur, if any do, but it is important to note that some of these rules are a little bit funky, and they may see erratas in the future. In addition, I'm going to be using Tabletop Simulator, or TTS, as a way to demonstrate some of these concepts. It's just a way to represent a virtual tabletop online and can be used to play full games of Warhammer 40k. In fact, if you want to do so, you can check out my Discord. We play TTS 40k constantly over there, and I'll link some videos in the video description and the card up in the corner for a tutorial video that will tell you how to get Tabletop Simulator 40k on your own machine. It is identical to Tabletop 40k, so just because it looks like a computer game doesn't mean it actually is. So all of the concepts that I talk about in TTS are going to translate directly over to the physical game as well. Now, these phases have changed dramatically from 9th edition and are probably one of the most complex parts of Warhammer 40k, both in the past traditionally and in 10th edition as it stands now. That's starting with the charge phase. This is the phase in which your units charge gloriously into melee. You will pick units one at a time that are within 12 inches of enemies and declare them to charge, if you want to. It's obviously optional, and you don't have to declare a charge if you don't want to, since it can trigger defensive effects like Overwatch, and charging into melee causes both units to fight each other, so you can take some additional damage that you won't necessarily want to have. In order to charge, you select one unit from your army that's within 12 inches of an enemy that hasn't advanced or fallen back this turn, and is also not an aircraft. Importantly, you also, without a special rule, can't charge after disembarking a transport that moved that turn, so keep that one in mind as well. Now, we're going to go through a whole sequence to resolve the charge, but once you've selected a unit to charge and resolve their charge, you're going to move on to the next one in your army and continue on until all the units that you wish to charge in your charge phase have done so. In order to charge, you select any number of enemy units within 12 inches of the charging unit. These are your charge targets. Now, it's important not to just select these indiscriminately, since you are going to have to, in order to successfully complete your charge, move into engagement with them, so within 1 inch of that enemy unit. This means that picking too many charge targets or targets that are too spread out can actually spread your unit out and make your charge difficult or even impossible to complete. You'll then roll 2d6, and the result of that roll is your charge distance. From there, you determine whether or not your charge succeeds. If that distance is enough to make a legal movement with your unit so that your unit is engaging every enemy that you selected as a charge target and only moves into engagement range of those units following all of the normal movement rules, so you can't move through the engagement range of other enemy units unless you have the fly keyword, and you still must respect terrain, so you have to climb over, breach through, or fly through the air over terrain, depending on your unit keywords and the type of terrain intervening, in order to successfully complete that charge. You also must end in unit coherency. So again, if you string out your unit too far to engage all of the charge targets, that will actually end up being an illegal charge. If all of those are possible with a movement using the distance that you rolled on your 2d6, your charge is successful, and you then go to move the unit. Now, the charge move is different than the theoretical move that you use to determine whether or not your charge is successful. So while in order for the charge to progress, you have to have moved to make that legal movement that ends with all of those criteria we talked about, it doesn't actually have to follow that path or end in that particular ending position. Instead, the charge move actually has different restrictions than the check to whether or not your charge is successful. When you make a charge move with a unit, you must move all members of that unit towards your charge target. So the distance between them from their starting position and their ending position has to be closing as you move that model along the battlefield. In addition, if it's possible for that model to end that movement in base contact with one of its charge targets, maintaining unit coherency and maintaining legal movement with all of the other rules in mind, it must do so. So while the charge completion requirements are that you are able to move into engagement range, the charge movement requirements are that you move base to base, but only if it's possible, and with your unit in unit coherency. So if moving base to base would move your unit out of coherency, you actually do not have to do so. Now, with all combat moves, including charge moves and pile in and consolidate moves that we'll talk about later, this base-to-base requirement is determined on a per-model basis. So you can actually move your models in such an order that it makes it impossible for other models in their unit to move to base contact with enemies, making it so that they are no longer required to move base contact with those enemies and have a little bit more freedom of movement. Moving base contact is actually kind of bad for you because it locks you in place and doesn't let you perform any more pile in or consolidate moves later on in the turn. So often times you'll want to maneuver your unit such that the fewest number of models possible are base to base with your target. Depending on the situation, obviously. Sometimes you just want more attacks engaged, and sometimes moving base to base is just fine. Now, last but certainly not least here is the weird implication of these charge rules, making the theoretical move that we talked about earlier to determine whether or not your charge is successful, and the actual charge that you make once you roll those two dice different. That implication is that the charge distance that you rolled is the maximum distance you can move, but you move up to that distance. Obviously, with the requirement that if you can move base to base, you must do so, and the entirety of the move that you elect to make moves towards your charge targets. However, if you can't move into base to base contact, you actually don't have to do so, and there's no requirement to move a maximum distance. So what you can potentially do is, if you roll low on your charge, but enough to make yourself into engagement range, actually move outside of engagement of enemy units, but because you still successfully completed your charge, then activate later in the fight phase and move to fight them. So to demonstrate the charge phase, here we are in the situation where this assault squad here on the left wants to charge this termagant squad on the right. They've rolled a 1 and a 4 on their 2d6 inch charge roll, so they're moving 5 inches in order to complete their charge. Now, we can see that this charge can be successful. We have to move within an inch in order to complete the charge successfully. We can do so in ending the move with every model in the unit in this sort of way would keep the unit in coherency, be in engagement range of all of our charge targets, and otherwise fulfill all of the normal restrictions that movement has. So successfully, we have made a charge. Now we have to make a charge move. Now in this case, we're just over 4 inches away from the target unit. And because the charge rules specify that we must end in base contact with this unit, we have to basically move as many models in base contact as we can. Now this termagant in front is the only one that the Assault Marines can move into base contact with. So one way that you can actually keep yourselves clear of having to move too many models in base contact is actually moving such that you get less models in base contact than you would normally be allowed. So in this case, for example, this model could get to base contact with this termagant. This model could clearly get to base contact, and at the same time, this model could. But if we wanted to, we could actually move in such a way that less models get base to base here. So, for example, if this Eviscerator guy moves up base to base, and this Chainsword guy moves up base to base, the Sergeant now can't get base to base because his other models have actually completed the movement. He can't end overlapping his other models, and while he can move through them, which is important to remember because that is an advantage of the movement rules in 10th edition, he can't end overlapping them. So he is forced to move towards his charge target, but on a different angle. So he can move over here, and that keeps him open to perform additional combat moves later. Since once these models move base to base with the Termagant, they would no longer be able to perform pile-in and consolidate moves later on in the phase. These two models are too far away to do so, however, so they're just going to chill in the back here. Now let's say we're in a basically identical situation, and these models had, instead of rolling a 5, had rolled a 4. Now their charge is still successful because while completing all of the normal movement restrictions, they can move at least one model towards the target unit and into engagement range of it. However, they can no longer move base to base. So that determination, whether or not they can get into engagement range, means that the charge is successful. However, the distance they can move is up to 4 inches. So what we're going to do in this situation is move every model just outside 1 inch of the target unit. And the reason for this is that because your charge was successful, you rolled enough to get to engagement range, you are able to be selected to fight in the fight phase. However, and we'll talk about this in the fight phase rules later on, if a unit did not charge this turn and is not engaged by any enemy units, then it cannot be selected to fight until it is, which means that this termagant unit is not able to interrupt until the assault squad engages it. So if your opponent has a bunch of CP remaining and could potentially use counter-offensive to fight before you in the fight phase, then you can actually get around that. So for example, if elsewhere on the table you've charged a different and more dangerous enemy unit, you could fight with them first, get base-to-base contact, then the termagants can't be selected to fight with counter-offensive because they are not in engagement range of your Assault Marines, and the Assault Marines can then activate and perform their combat moves that we'll talk about in the next section. This is new as of 10th edition. It's an entirely new evolution of the rules, and it is pretty chicanerous, but again, it requires you to roll exactly enough to successfully complete your charge, but not get into base-to-base contact, which is pretty difficult. Now, there are some other situations in which charges can fail, even though they look like they are going to succeed. Now, in this one, the termagants are a legal charge target for the Assault Marines over here. They're within 12 inches, and it is possible to get into engagement range of them. However, if the Assault Marines don't roll a super high charge, they only roll a 6, for example, they have to be able to complete that move legally. And in this case, while they are infantry and they can breach through this terrain, if the terrain is physically intervening where their charge would potentially land, so what they want to do is charge into here, essentially, but they're not going to be able to do so because of the way the wall and the termagants are spaced, then that is not a successful charge. They would have to roll a much higher number to get all the way around the termagants in order to successfully complete that charge. Now, similarly, it can also be the case that we have multiple legal charge targets, but only one of them is actually going to be successfully able to be charged. So, for example, we have a bunch of termagants both on the left and the right, and the Assault Marine squads would like to engage both. However, if they don't roll super high on their charge, or if the units are too far spaced apart, you can actually come into a situation by which basically, even though you can technically engage both units successfully with your charge, if you're not able to complete that charge in unit coherency, so with all models in the unit within 2 inches of other models, then unfortunately that charge would not be successful. So you do have to be careful of what your charge targets are, because while you can technically select them as the charge target, your charge can potentially be either incredibly difficult or literally impossible to complete, even though they're a legal target. It's also important to note that this only checks during that first theoretical to determine whether or not your charge is successful. When you actually go to move the unit, you can move them towards one of the charge targets or the other one. But if you can't string your unit to engage both of them legally with that determination of whether the charge succeeds or not, then you can move towards neither and the charge fails. Now, before we move off our discussion about the charge phase, I want to cover 2 core stratagems that can affect the charge phase. The first one is Tank Shock. This is eligible to be used on a vehicle from your army, and importantly, must be used before your charge. It costs 1 command point and has the potential to do mortal wounds after you contact an enemy unit with a successful charge. You select 1 enemy unit in engagement range of that vehicle after it makes that charge move, and you roll a bunch of dice equal to the strength characteristic of your biggest strength weapon, adding 2 more if your strength is higher than the toughness of the unit that you ended in contact with. For each 5+ you roll, you'll deal a mortal wound. This is most useful on large vehicles, especially things like walkers and knights that have hugely powerful melee weapons, and has the potential to actually kill the unit that you charged. If you do so, or if you have other impact style effects that will do damage on a successful charge and you do kill your charge target, your charge is still successful and you can still pile in and fight afterwards using all of the rules that we'll discuss later. Importantly, however, with Tank Shock, you must use this stratagem before you make the charge with the vehicle. You can't make the charge successfully and then declare a Tank Shock, because Tank Shock only gives you an ability that triggers after your charge is completed. So if you use it after you finish your charge move, it's already too late. wait. Now, the other stratagem I want to talk about is heroic intervention. This occurs after your opponent ends a charge move, so this is used defensively in your opponent's charge phase. Importantly, you can't use this on any sort of counter charges or other heroic intervention abilities in your own charge phase. You can only use it on your opponent's turn. And it lets one of your units that's within 6 inches of an enemy unit that's successfully charged to charge that unit back. You resolve the charge as normal, however, the unit doesn't get always strikes first. So a target enemy unit that charged itself could potentially hit your heroically intervening unit before they attack the enemy. That said, because it is a successful charge, regardless of whether or not your unit that performed the intervention is in engagement range of an enemy when it comes to their turn to fight, they are still eligible to attack. So even if your opponent loses models and disengages the heroically intervening unit, or piles in or consolidates out of range of them, then you'll still get to select the intervening unit to fight. Are you gearing up for Warhammer 40k's 10th edition, but unsure of what war gear you want your units to be equipped with? With a new rule set for the game comes a ton of new challenges, and it's hard to be prepared for everything. You've got new opposing armies to play against, new enemy units to contend with, and a quickly changing metagame. Maybe you're worried about erratas impacting your models or the loadouts you've assembled them with. Well, I have an easy solution for you, and that is magnets. And the easiest way to access that easy solution is the Magnet Baron, your one-stop shop for all of your model modularity needs. Modularity needs. Nailed it. The Magnet Baron is the best place to go to get your armies ready for playing within the new edition. They offer magnetization sets for a wide variety of Warhammer 40k model kits that includes the specific components that you need to magnetize them and allow them to build in any loadout available. So your units can remain flexible without having to break the bank buying additional bits or extra models. Not only that, but the Magnet Baron also includes a wide variety of other useful gaming accessories, including sturdy flight stands that don't snap as soon as you take them out of the box, convenient movement trays for moving large units around, as well as a wide variety of hobby magnets in a frankly ridiculous selection of shapes and sizes. So you can modulate any bit for any model and any part of your collection. So check them out at themagnetbaron.com to get your army ready for the new edition of Warhammer 40k and remain flexible as the game develops. Now, once all of your units that you want to charge into the enemy have successfully performed their charges and completed all of the steps in the charge phase, it goes to the fight phase. And the fight phase is when you and your opponent both select units to fight with. Now, units that completed a charge earlier in that turn have an ability called Fight First. And you'll also find that some datasheets or unit attachments will also have or grant the Fight First ability. Units with Fight First go in a separate phase at the start of the fight phase. Then all units that don't have Fight First, which is generally units that were charged and don't have that ability built in, or units that are locked into an ongoing combat that hasn't resolved yet, that's when they fight. Now, in both steps of this phase, the inactive player, meaning the player whose turn it is not, gets to select the first fighter, both in the Fights First section and in the Fighting Normal section. This means that having Fights First as a defensive buff actually makes you very difficult to engage with by charging units, since you get the opportunity to fight them before they fight you. Whereas otherwise, if you don't have Fight First, any charging units that charge into you are going to get the opportunity to fight before you do, because they get the Fights First roll upon a successful charge. Now, for a unit to be legally selected to fight during the fight phase, they must either be in engagement range of an enemy or have successfully completed a charge that turn. It is possible to bring other units into engagement range as the fight phase continues, so if that is the case, then that unit will activate later on in the turn following the normal sequence. When it becomes your turn to activate a unit and a unit is able to fight in that section of the fight phase, either fight first or fight normally, then the player who is currently up to choose to fight will pick a unit to fight with. They'll go through the pile in, make attacks, and consolidate sections, as we will discuss momentarily here, and then the opponent will get an opportunity to do the same thing, and you'll keep going until all eligible units on the table have fought a single time.
Now, one core stratagem that we should talk about in this section, and that I've actually mentioned previously in the video that can interrupt the normal flow of the fight phase, is counteroffensive. This, for 2 CP, is usable in either fight phase, either you or your opponent, but it will typically be used in your opponent's fight phase, and it triggers after an enemy unit has attacked. Once that unit has fought, so completed their pile-in, fight, and consolidation steps, like we'll talk about later on in the video, you can then select one of your own units to fight, assuming that that unit is eligible to fight. So either they've charged this turn, or they're currently in engagement range of an enemy unit. Now, this doesn't allow a unit to fight more than one time. It's not like a double fight sort of effect, but what it does do is allow your unit to break the normal sequence. So if your opponent has a bunch of units with the fight's first ability, either because they charged or because they have them on their datasheet, they can fight with one of them, and then before going on to select the next one to fight, you can instead fight with one of your own units. This is extremely useful if your opponent is charging a lot of your army, and if they've engaged multiple units with chargers, they can potentially open themselves up to a counteroffensive, allowing you to fight with one of those units that's defending against the charge.
Now, when you select a unit to fight, they first make what is called a pile-in move. This is a 3-inch move towards the nearest enemy model to them. This is determined on a per model basis. So you're not checking which unit is closest to your unit, you're checking individual models. And again, all other movement restrictions to this apply. So for example, you must climb around terrain, and you have to end that move in unit coherency. However, you can move into the engagement range of enemy units, which will potentially bring them into combat with you and allow you to attack them. Pile-in and consolidate moves that we'll talk about a little bit later cannot be made if the model is already in base contact with another enemy model. In addition, they also cannot be made if your unit cannot get into engagement range with another enemy unit. If you are already in engagement range with them, it is legal for you to pile in, because it's actually impossible at that point to move away from that other unit, because you'd have to be moving towards the closest model, and if you're an inch away from the closest enemy model and no one else is around, they're obviously going to be the closest thing. Now, importantly, this is measured on a per unit basis, not a per model basis, so as long as one model from the unit can engage another enemy model, the entire unit can perform the pile-in just fine. Importantly, you don't have to move base to base with the model that is closest to you. So, if there's a way to continuously get closer to that model while then basing another enemy model that started farther away, then that is perfectly legal. And we'll talk about some ways that this could potentially occur right now. Now let's talk about pile-ins. So we've just made a charge with our Assault Marine squad here into the Termagants, and we didn't quite roll high enough to get our models in base-to-base contact, so they aren't required to do so. However, when we come to the fight step, they did still make a successful charge, and in this case they were engaged, so they can be selected to fight. So we select them to fight, and they move towards the closest enemy unit, and if they can move base-to-base contact, they must do so if possible. So, for example, all of these models are then going to move closer to the closest enemy model that they can. The end must move in engagement range, which of course it will because we started in engagement range. However, again, just like charging, we can run into situations where your own models can body block you from having to be base-to-base contact. Once we get to selecting targets for attacks, we're going to talk about the fact that you can fight through other ones of your models that are base contact with enemies. So you can set up situations like this that can make these models eligible to fight, but then also eligible to pile in later. Now, the pile-in rules require that you get closer to the closest enemy model, but don't necessarily require that you base-to-base that model. Instead, if you can base-to-base at least one enemy, you must do so, but it can be any enemy that you can legally move towards. So, if, for example, we want to get into melee with the Screamer Killer over here with our big Thunderhammer and our Eviscerator, so what we can do, we can see that the Space Marine Sergeant in the front of the Assault Squad here is closest to this Termagant, which means that as it's moving, the distance between it and the Termagant must be shrinking. It essentially has to end that movement closer to the Termagant than it began. So what we could do is move closer to the Termagant on this diagonal fashion, but end up moving base to base with the Screamer Killer. Because we can move base to base with that model, with at least one enemy, then we do so. However, obviously we are about a fifth of an inch closer to the Termagant than we began, so that is a legal pile-in move, and we've ended it legally. In this case, we can then also do the same thing with the Eviscerator. Both these models can fight through each other and fight into the Screamer Killer, and the rest of the unit can pile in as normal. And with that being the case, that can allow you to do some chicanery to get the attacks from your unit where you want to on enemy units. Now, last but certainly not least, there are, of course, going to be situations where you can no longer pile in. You must end a pile in move with your unit within an inch of at least one enemy unit. And so essentially that means that you must begin the pile in move at least 4 inches from an enemy unit. So let's say these poor termagants all get murdered. They then check for another enemy unit that they could pile into melee with. In this case, the Carnifex is going to be the closest enemy. However, they are not within 4 inches. And 4 inches is the operative number here because it gives you a 3-inch pile in move plus your then 1-inch engagement range. And as we can see here, we are going to be out of engagement range after we make that pile in move, which means the pile in move is in fact not legal, and this guy would have to bump back to where he started. Now, in the next section, after we talk about attacks, we're going to talk about consolidation moves, and that is not necessarily the case for consolidation moves, so stay tuned for that. So now you've piled in and engaged a bunch of enemy models and units with your unit that maybe charged or maybe didn't. Now you go to making attacks. And like I said earlier, we're not going to go through the whole attack sequence and how attacks are resolved in this video, but if you want to see that in the future, let me know and I'll do a video on it. But for a long story short, your models in melee can target enemy models that are within their engagement range, so 1 inch, or in base contact with another model that is in base contact with you. Now, importantly, unlike previous editions of 40k, there are no other requirements for targeting models in melee, meaning that units that charged that turn or were charged that turn can target whatever they want. So it's possible that you charge into a unit, another charging unit kills them, or your pile-in moves are suitable to move you into engagement range of a different unit that you didn't charge. You are then allowed to make attacks targeting them. You can also potentially charge into a unit, engage it, but then activate it in the fight phase, and it's able to pile into a different one of your units, which it can then fight. So you have to be careful about when and where you engage with your enemy because it can potentially allow them to target units that you weren't expecting. Now, talking about allocating and resolving attacks in the fight phase, we have a multi-combat here between a bunch of Primaris Crusaders with High Marshal Helbrecht attached to them and an Assault Marine squad that are both charging these Termagants. The Termagants are screening out the Carnifex here, so preventing the Space Marines from getting into melee with it, and the Space Marine player would very much like to kill that thing. Now, one way that the fight phase can be sequenced by the player who has control over it is that you could potentially kill these Termagants before the Primaris Crusaders are forced to fight. So, for example, the Space Marine player here would go with their Assault Marines first and kill the Termagants with their melee attacks. That then allows High Marshal Helbrecht's unit to go. And while in previous editions you could not target units that you did not declare as a charge, and so clearly Helbrecht's unit charged the Termagants because they were in the way, that is no longer the case in 10th edition. So Helbrecht's unit, because it can now pile in, it can pile in to engage a new enemy, which it can with the Carnifex, it can then pile in and actually fight that Carnifex. So sequencing your charges and your fights is very important. And if you have any way to deal damage with things like impact attacks or tank shocks, for example, before the fight phase begins, you can even use those to clear out units that you charge into, and then, because you successfully completed your charge, fight as normal, pile in, and invite new enemy units that you could not have targeted at the start of the charge phase. Now, another benefit here for these units with multi-size bases is the new ranked fighting rule. Basically, you can target an enemy with attacks if you're within an inch of it. Now, obviously, the only model within an inch of the Screamer Killer is Helbrecht himself. However, the other option that you have is that you can target models that are engaged, or units, I should say, that are engaged with an ally in your unit that is base to base with that allied model. So, in this case, these Primaris Crusaders, who are touching High Marshal Helbrecht here, can fight through him into the Carnifex. So this is one reason that, especially in units like these Crusaders that have multiple different base sizes in them, leading the charge with the larger bases actually gives you more surface area on those bases to base your own units and then fight through them to target the enemy units that they're engaging. And actually makes your engagements a lot easier. Otherwise, these models would have to get themselves physically within an inch of the target in order to fight, and even if they were within an inch, their other friendly models base to base with them would not be able to fight through them because they're not in base to base. You must have a ranked attack situation like this for these Primaris Crusaders to attack in this situation. However, obviously, basing Heimlich or Helbrecht, they would also be able to fight. Now, after a unit attacks, it can perform what's called a consolidation move. And this is basically almost identical to piling in with a couple additional exceptions. Each model in a unit that's performing a consolidation must move towards the closest enemy model, determined on a per model basis, and if possible, move into base-to-base contact with at least one enemy. You must, however, in order to complete the movement, move your unit into engagement range of another enemy unit, or if you're already in engagement range, then you're good to go. Now, the extra exception is that if this is impossible, you can instead then consolidate towards the nearest objective marker. However, just kind of like engaging enemy units with your pile in and consolidate moves, you have to end this movement within 3 inches of an objective marker. Just like already being engaged at the start of these moves, if you are already within 3 inches of an objective marker, then that criteria is automatically going to complete. So if all the enemies around you have been killed, you can always move towards that objective. However, just like not being able to pile in and consolidate when you're base to base with people, if you are touching or overlapping the objective marker as is allowed by the new tournament player pack, you are not then able to move closer to that objective marker since that's not possible, so you don't move at all. Again, this is determined on a per model basis, so each model moves towards the objective marker that they are closest to, and each model must be reducing that distance as they move, and with all of the other movement restrictions fulfilled. So how exactly does this consolidating thing work? We'll give some examples here. Now, obviously, the Assault Marines here have charged these poor Termagants and probably murdered them. After their pile-in move, they move so that they're base-to-base contacts with the Termagants or base-to-base with each other so that they can fight through, getting closer to the Termagants if possible, and if base-to-base if they can. They can then perform a consolidation move. Now, this has all of the same requirements as the pile-in move, meaning it's a 3-inch move towards the closest enemy model on a per-model basis. However, the unit must end in engagement range in order to make that move. Now, the move is not required, so in this situation, the Assault Marines could stay put and elect not to perform a consolidation move. It is a may ability, so they don't have to do it. But if they do elect to, they must move towards the closest enemy, who is this Carnifex, and they must move base-to-base contact with it. Now, what you can do is limit your base-to-base with it if you want to, but in this situation, that's not going to be that much of a deal. Now, why would you not want to do this? If the Carnifex is not already fought in that fight phase, it can then be selected next to fight with. So if the Assault Marines here engage the Carnifex, then it would be able to attack and swing back at them and potentially kill them. So that is a situation in which you would not want to consolidate into another enemy. Now, to be fair, if the Carnifex wasn't here, this consolidation couldn't take place because this unit would have no other enemies within, just like we talked about with piling in, within that 4-inch bubble, unless there is an objective marker. So let's say, for example, instead that these Termagants were protecting this objective marker. They are within 3 inches of the objective marker. We can see that this is the 40 millimeter objective marker base right here. We can see if we shrink it down. That's the actual marker token itself, but this is showing the 3-inch radius or projection that you have to actually stand on to contribute your level of control to the objective marker. And the Termagants are positioned such that the Assault Marines can't get to the objective marker with their pile-in or charge moves. Now, assuming that the Assault Marines charge, they pile into this position, they all get to attack, and they kill the Termagants. There are no enemies in this situation within 4 inches of them, so there are no enemies that they can consolidate towards and get to engagement range of. However, if that is not the case, and this is specifically in situations where they cannot engage another unit, they can't do this normally, then they can instead measure towards the closest objective marker. So in this one situation where they've killed all the enemies that they're engaging, they're not base to base, and there is an objective marker here and they can't engage anyone else, they can then instead make their consolidate moves towards the objective marker itself, and that again being the little 40 millimeter puck is what they're actually measuring towards. They have to end this movement within this 3-inch control zone of the objective marker in order to actually legally complete that move. So if they had made that charge much farther back here, for example, that would not be legal and they would not be able to consolidate since they could not get to the objective marker and they could not get to any other units, but because they're close enough, then they can do that. That's one thing to keep in mind, is that there's a lot of situations where you're actually not able to consolidate onto objectives because you're not close enough or other enemy units are preventing you from doing so. Now, just like being base-to-base contact, this little puck, again, is the actual objective marker itself. If you are overlapping or touching it, it is impossible for you to get closer for that model specifically, so it is impossible for them to move. That any models that are touching the actual 40mm objective little thingamajig will not move at all. And if the unit is already in 3 inches of the objective marker, the requirement that they end the consolidation move within 3 inches of the objective marker is automatically fulfilled. So they're going to be able to make the consolidation move towards it regardless. So there can be situations where you fight and then move towards it to get back away from enemy models. And it's important to remember that this movement is not allowed in the pile-in move. It used to be, back in previous editions, that pile-in and consolidate moves were functionally identical. That is no longer the case. Pile-in moves can't make this movement towards objectives, only consolidate moves can. And with that, those are all of the combat movement rules for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. These are wildly complex and have so many restrictions and caveats to them that it is difficult to keep them straight. So I hope that this video helps you in some small way. A lot of the requirements that you move into engagement range of other units or base-to-base contact, if you can, are new in 10th edition, and I do think that they maybe make these rules a little bit too complex. But that's why we're talking about them, and let me know if there are any more complex mechanics in the 10th edition of the game that I can break down for you. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to Magnet Baron for sponsoring the video. Please go check them out at themagnetbaron.com, as well as everyone who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.